The hunting horns never stopped echoing through Devil's Canyon, even after the last tracker had vanished without a trace. This isn't just another Western revenge story. It's about what happens when desperation meets cunning in the most unforgiving corners of 1852 America. The year was 1852, and the Red Rock Canyons of southern Utah held secrets in their shadowed depths that civilized society preferred to forget. When wealthy plantation heir Jeremiah Blackwood organized the most elaborate hunting expedition in territorial history, he never imagined that his human property would transform from prey into predators. Two enslaved brothers, Samuel and Joshua Freeman, had spent years learning every trail, every water source, and every hiding place in those treacherous canyons. But Blackwood's hunting party wasn't tracking deer or elk. They were hunting runaway slaves for sport, and they had chosen the wrong quarry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hunting horns never stopped echoing through Devil's Canyon, even after the last tracker had vanished without a trace. The sound drifted across the red sandstone walls at dawn and dusk, carried by desert winds that seemed to mock the silence where 12 men's voices should have been. Local Ute tribesmen who traded at Fort Bridger spoke of hearing the horns during winter storms, when no living soul could survive in those frozen canyons. The Army patrols that occasionally swept through the territory reported the same phenomenon. Brass instruments calling across emptiness where only bones should remain. This haunting melody wasn't the work of spirits or mountain echoes. It was evidence of what happened when desperate men with nothing left to lose encountered the wilderness skills that their oppressors never bothered to recognize. The year was 1852, and the carved canyons of southern Utah territory held secrets in their layered stone walls that polite society would spend decades trying to forget. Captain James Morrison of the Territorial Militia filed his final report on the Blackwood expedition in November 1852, 3 months after the hunting party had departed Fort Bridger with enough supplies for 2 weeks in the wilderness. His words, preserved in the Utah Territorial Archives, captured the bewilderment of men trained in conventional warfare trying to understand an enemy that fought by different rules entirely. No evidence of Indian attack or wild animal predation, Morrison wrote in his careful script. 12 well-armed men, experienced hunters familiar with canyon country, simply vanished. Their horses returned to Fort Bridger without riders, saddlebags intact, weapons unfired. Most disturbing, we continue to receive reports of hunting horns sounding from Devil's Canyon during conditions when no human being could survive exposure. What Captain Morrison couldn't have known was that 2 men not only survived those harsh conditions, but had transformed the canyon itself into an instrument of perfect justice. Samuel and Joshua Freeman had spent 4 years learning every hidden spring, every sheltered alcove, and every secret passage in that maze of stone. They understood the canyon's moods, its seasonal patterns, and most importantly, how to use its isolation as a weapon against those who had weaponized isolation against them. The official explanation satisfied territorial authorities who had no desire to investigate too deeply into the affairs of wealthy plantation families. Jeremiah Blackwood's hunting expedition had simply encountered the standard dangers of frontier life. Wild animals, treacherous terrain, or hostile tribes could easily account for the disappearance of any group foolish enough to venture into uncharted territory without proper preparation. But local settlements knew better. Trading post operators, army scouts, and mountain men who made their living in the wilderness all shared the same observation. Devil's Canyon had changed after the Blackwood party's disappearance. The wildlife patterns shifted. Water sources that had run clear for decades now carried a metallic taste, and most unnervingly, the acoustic properties of the canyon seemed altered in ways that defied natural explanation. The Ute chief Running Bear, who had negotiated safe passage through the territory for white settlers since the Mexican War, offered his own assessment during a meeting with Territorial Governor Brigham Young in early 1853. His words, recorded by Young's secretary and found decades later in Mormon church archives, provided insight that official reports had missed. 2 shadows learned the canyon's language, Running Bear said through an interpreter. They speak to stone and wind in ways white men never understood. The canyon listens now to voices it ignored before. What you call disappearance, we call transformation. The hunting horns call to remind all who hear them that some prey becomes predator when pushed beyond endurance. The transformation Running Bear described had begun not with violence, but with knowledge accumulated through years of forced labor in some of the most unforgiving terrain on the continent. Samuel and Joshua Freeman had been compelled to learn survival skills that their enslavers never bothered to master, creating expertise that would prove decisive when circumstances forced them to choose between submission and resistance. Desert survival required intimate understanding of water sources, weather patterns, and the delicate balance between conservation and expenditure of energy in an environment where mistakes killed quickly. The Freeman brothers had mastered these skills out of necessity, spending countless hours maintaining their master's hunting camps, tracking game through terrain that challenged even experienced frontiersmen, and ensuring the comfort of men who regarded their knowledge as merely another form of property. But knowledge once gained becomes impossible to contain. Samuel had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded flash floods, the almost imperceptible changes in wind direction that announced incoming storms, and the animal behaviors that revealed hidden water sources. Joshua had developed an uncanny ability to navigate by stars, to identify edible plants in seemingly barren landscapes, and to move through rocky terrain without leaving tracks that could be followed by pursuers. These skills, acquired through years of servitude, would prove to be the foundation for a reversal of fortune that territorial authorities would struggle to comprehend. When desperate men possess superior knowledge of the battlefield, the outcome becomes predetermined regardless of conventional advantages in numbers or equipment. The hunting horns that continued echoing through Devil's Canyon served as more than supernatural curiosity. They were announcements of a new order, a declaration that the canyon now belonged to those who understood its secrets rather than those who merely claimed ownership through legal documents filed in distant territorial capitals. The year 1852 marked a crucial transition in Utah Territory's development, caught between the Mexican cession's legal complexities and the Mormon settlement's expanding influence. Southern Utah remained largely unmapped wilderness, its network of canyons and mesas providing refuge for outlaws, religious dissidents, and anyone seeking to escape the reach of conventional authority. The territorial government in Salt Lake City exercised nominal control over vast regions they had never surveyed, creating legal gray areas where property rights meant little beyond what could be defended by force. Into this lawless landscape came men like Jeremiah Blackwood, heir to a Virginia tobacco fortune who had relocated to Utah Territory specifically to exploit these legal ambiguities. Unlike the Mormon settlers who sought religious freedom or the miners chasing California gold, Blackwood represented a different breed of frontier opportunist. He understood that territorial status created opportunities for those with sufficient capital to purchase influence before formal legal structures could be established. Blackwood's operation centered on a sprawling ranch complex built into a natural amphitheater where three canyons converged, creating a hidden valley accessible only through narrow passages that could be easily defended. The location provided everything necessary for his particular vision of frontier enterprise. Abundant water from year-round springs, natural corrals formed by stone formations, and most importantly, complete isolation from territorial oversight or interference. The ranch buildings reflected Blackwood's ambitions rather than frontier practicality. The main house stood 3 stories tall, constructed from local sandstone and topped with imported slate tiles that had been hauled across 2,000 miles of wilderness at enormous expense. Broad verandas wrapped around both levels, creating outdoor spaces designed for entertaining rather than protection against harsh weather. The entire structure proclaimed its owner's determination to transplant Southern aristocratic culture into Utah Territory, regardless of environmental realities. Supporting structures included a large bunkhouse for hired hands, several specialized buildings for processing leather and storing supplies, and most significantly, quarters for enslaved workers that Blackwood had transported from his Virginia properties, despite territorial laws that theoretically prohibited slavery. The legal complexities of slavery in Utah Territory created exactly the kind of ambiguous situation that men like Blackwood exploited routinely. The Compromise of 1850 had admitted Utah as a territory with popular sovereignty regarding slavery, meaning local residents would eventually vote on the question. Until that vote occurred, existing property relationships remained technically legal, creating a window where enslaved people could be brought into territorial boundaries and held under the fiction that they were voluntary workers bound by long-term contracts. Blackwood's legal strategy relied on documentation that portrayed his enslaved workers as indentured servants who had agreed to extended service terms in exchange for transportation and eventual freedom. The contracts, written in language designed to confuse rather than clarify, created obligations that could theoretically be fulfilled but practically never would be. Workers were charged for food, housing, transportation, and equipment at rates that ensured their debt would increase faster than their labor could reduce it. Samuel Freeman, 28 years old and literate, despite laws prohibiting the education of enslaved people, understood the mathematics of his situation with crystalline clarity. At current debt accumulation rates, he would need to work for approximately 47 years to earn theoretical freedom, assuming no illness, injury, or additional charges for infraction of increasingly complex rules. His younger brother Joshua, 25 and possessed of an eidetic memory that allowed him to navigate by landmarks seen only once, had calculated similar numbers for his own situation. The Freeman brothers had arrived in Utah Territory as part of Blackwood's initial workforce, transported in wagons that also carried furniture, livestock, and other property necessary for establishing the ranch operation. The journey across 2,000 miles of frontier territory had provided education and survival skills that would prove invaluable, though neither brother could have anticipated how they would eventually apply this knowledge. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Desert travel taught lessons unavailable in Virginia's humid climate and cultivated landscape. Water became precious rather than abundant, requiring careful calculation of consumption rates and detailed knowledge of reliable sources. Navigation by stars and landmarks replaced familiar roads and established communities. Most importantly, the harsh environment revealed that survival depended on competence rather than social status, creating situations where enslaved workers often possessed superior knowledge compared to their supposed masters. Jeremiah Blackwood's hunting expeditions served multiple purposes beyond simple recreation. They demonstrated his wealth and sophistication to territorial officials whose favor he needed for future business ventures. They provided opportunities to explore potential mining claims and grazing rights in territory that formal surveys had not yet mapped. Most significantly, they established his reputation as a man whose wealth and connections placed him above the ordinary restraints that governed frontier society. The expeditions followed a predictable pattern that had developed over 4 years of operation. Blackwood would invite guests from Salt Lake City's territorial government, successful Mormon merchants who controlled much of the territory's economic activity, and occasionally federal officials whose goodwill could prove valuable for future enterprises. These guests would arrive at the ranch expecting luxury accommodations and entertainment that demonstrated their host's superior resources and cultural refinement. Hunting parties typically lasted 2 weeks, with the first few days spent in comfortable base camps close to the ranch while guests accustomed themselves to desert conditions. Subsequent days involved progressively more challenging expeditions into the canyon country, where Blackwood could display his intimate knowledge of the terrain and his workforce's specialized skills in navigating treacherous territory. Samuel and Joshua served as guides for these expeditions. Their responsibilities, including route planning, camp setup, game tracking, and ensuring the safety of guests who often possessed more enthusiasm than competence for wilderness travel. Over 4 years, they had mapped hundreds of square miles of canyon country, identifying water sources, seasonal game patterns, weather hazards, and the countless details necessary for survival in an environment where mistakes proved fatal quickly. But the brothers had also observed patterns in their master's behavior that created opportunities for those patient enough to wait and intelligent enough to plan. Blackwood's arrogance made him predictable. His routines created vulnerabilities, and his assumptions about his workforce's capabilities blinded him to possibilities that more careful observers might have anticipated. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test everything both sides had learned about survival, strategy, and the price of underestimating desperate men with superior knowledge of the battlefield. Jeremiah Blackwood stood 6 feet tall with the bearing of a man who had never questioned his right to command others. At 34, he possessed the soft hands and pale complexion of inherited wealth, combined with the calculating intelligence that had allowed his family to accumulate and maintain their Virginia fortune through 3 generations of tobacco cultivation. His relocation to Utah Territory reflected strategic thinking rather than adventure-seeking, an opportunity to establish a Western empire built on the same principles of controlled labor and political influence that had served his family in Virginia. Blackwood's education at the University of Virginia had provided classical training in literature, law, and political theory, but his real expertise lay in understanding how power functioned in practice rather than theory. He had observed how his father managed hundreds of enslaved workers, how state legislators could be influenced through careful combination of social pressure and financial incentives, and how legal systems could be manipulated by those with sufficient resources and connections. The transition to Utah Territory required adapting these skills to frontier conditions while maintaining the essential power relationships that ensured profitability. Blackwood understood that territorial status created opportunities for those bold enough to act before formal legal structures could be established. Land claims, mineral rights, and political influence could all be secured by men willing to invest heavily in uncertain ventures. His wife, Catherine Blackwood, brought additional resources and connections to their Western enterprise. The daughter of a Richmond banking family, she had married Jeremiah as much for strategic advantage as personal affection, understanding that their combined wealth and influence could create opportunities unavailable to either family independently. At 29, she possessed the social skills necessary for entertaining territorial officials and the practical intelligence required for managing complex household operations in frontier conditions. Catherine's adaptation to Utah Territory revealed character traits that Virginia society had never required her to develop. She personally supervised the ranch's domestic operations, managed correspondence with suppliers in distant cities, and maintained detailed financial records that tracked every aspect of their expanding enterprise. Her education had prepared her for ornamental social roles, but frontier necessity had transformed her into a formidable business partner whose judgment Jeremiah relied upon for major decisions. Their three sons represented the next generation of Blackwood ambition. David, 16, had inherited his father's calculating intelligence along with his mother's practical skills, making him naturally suited for eventually assuming control of the family enterprise. William, 14, showed greater interest in the technical aspects of ranch operations, spending considerable time learning livestock management and construction techniques from hired specialists. James, 12, possessed an instinctive understanding of human psychology that allowed him to manipulate both family members and workers with unsettling effectiveness. The hired workforce consisted of 8 men recruited from various backgrounds for their specialized skills and willingness to work in isolated conditions. Most were former soldiers, miners, or trappers who understood frontier life but lacked the capital necessary for independent operations. They received wages supplemented by room, board, and occasional bonuses, creating loyalty based on mutual advantage rather than legal compulsion. These hired men occupied an intermediate position in the ranch hierarchy, superior to enslaved workers, but dependent on Blackwood's favor for continued employment. Their skills included horse training, leatherworking, basic carpentry, and the various specialized tasks required for maintaining operations in territory where replacement parts and professional services were unavailable. Samuel Freeman had been born into slavery on the Blackwood family's Virginia plantation, the son of skilled craftsmen who had taught him literacy, basic mathematics, and carpentry techniques, despite laws prohibiting enslaved people from acquiring such education. His intelligence and reliability had made him valuable enough that the family had invested in developing his capabilities rather than limiting him to simple labor. At 28, Samuel stood slightly above average height, with the lean build of a man accustomed to hard physical work. Years of outdoor labor had darkened his skin and created the calloused hands of someone familiar with tools and machinery. But his most valuable asset was a mind that absorbed information systematically, analyzing patterns and relationships that others missed or ignored. Samuel's literacy allowed him to read territorial newspapers, legal documents, and correspondence that revealed details about Blackwood's business operations and future plans. His mathematical skills enabled him to calculate debt accumulation rates, supply costs, and the various financial manipulations that kept workers permanently indebted. Most importantly, his carpentry background had taught him to think systematically about structural problems, approaching challenges through careful planning rather than impulsive action. Joshua Freeman, 3 years younger than his brother, possessed different but complementary capabilities. His eidetic memory allowed him to recall precise details of terrain, weather patterns, and animal behavior after single observations. Navigation came naturally to him, whether by stars, landmarks, or the subtle environmental cues that revealed direction and distance in unmarked wilderness. Joshua's specialty was tracking, a skill that required patience, observation, and the ability to read stories written in disturbed earth, broken vegetation, and animal sign. He could determine not just what had passed through an area, but when, in what condition, and often where they were heading, based on behavior patterns and environmental factors. The Freeman brothers had developed an almost telepathic communication style, born from years of working together under conditions where explicit discussion of plans or feelings could prove dangerous. Subtle gestures, meaningful glances, and carefully neutral statements allowed them to coordinate activities and share information while maintaining the appearance of simple compliance with orders. Their shared experiences had created unshakable loyalty combined with strategic patience. Both understood that survival depended on careful observation, meticulous planning, and the ability to wait for optimal opportunities rather than reacting impulsively to immediate provocations. They had spent 4 years learning everything possible about their captors' weaknesses while developing skills that could be turned to advantage when circumstances permitted. The relationship between the Blackwood family and their workforce reflected the complex dynamics of frontier society, where legal categories often mattered less than practical necessities. Formal authority rested with Jeremiah and his family, but day-to-day operations depended heavily on the specialized knowledge and skills of workers who understood local conditions better than their employers. This interdependence created vulnerabilities that both sides recognized but interpreted differently. The Blackwoods saw their workers' expertise as valuable property that enhanced their own capabilities and status. Samuel and Joshua understood that their knowledge represented power that could be redirected toward different purposes if circumstances ever provided the opportunity. The stage was now set for a test of wills between those who claimed ownership of others and those who understood that some things could never truly be owned. The autumn of 1852 brought unusual weather patterns that transformed routine hunting expeditions into tests of survival skills. Early October temperatures had dropped 20 degrees below normal, creating conditions that challenged even experienced frontiersmen. Snow appeared on canyon rims 6 weeks ahead of schedule, and water sources that typically flowed year-round began showing signs of freezing. These environmental factors added urgency to plans that both sides had been developing throughout the year. Jeremiah Blackwood's final hunting expedition was intended to be his most ambitious, a 3-week journey deep into the canyon country that would establish his reputation as the territory's premier guide for wealthy sportsmen seeking authentic wilderness experiences. His guest list included 2 territorial legislators, a federal marshal, and a wealthy merchant from California, whose investments could provide capital for future ventures. The expedition's scope required exceptional preparation. Supplies for 15 men over 3 weeks included not just food and equipment, but luxury items designed to demonstrate Blackwood's sophistication. Wine from his personal cellar, imported delicacies, portable furniture that would allow comfortable dining in wilderness camps, and specialized hunting gear that showcased the latest developments in firearms technology. Blackwood spent weeks planning routes that would showcase the most spectacular scenery while providing adequate hunting opportunities. The itinerary included visits to hidden ruins left by ancient peoples, natural arches that framed distant mountains, and secluded valleys where game congregated during seasonal migrations. Each location had been selected to create memorable experiences that would generate positive reports when guests returned to their influential positions. The expedition would demonstrate Blackwood's comprehensive mastery of territorial resources. His knowledge of secret trails, reliable water sources, and optimal hunting grounds would prove his value as a partner for future business ventures. More importantly, the successful completion of such an ambitious journey would establish his credibility as someone capable of large-scale operations requiring complex logistics and careful planning. Samuel Freeman had spent the entire year observing and recording details about Blackwood's hunting expeditions that revealed patterns useful for strategic planning. Guest preferences, typical daily routines, security precautions, and most importantly, the specific roles assigned to different workers during extended wilderness travel. This information formed the foundation for a plan that had evolved through months of careful refinement. The Freeman brothers understood that their master's ambitions created opportunities for those patient enough to wait and prepared enough to act when circumstances aligned properly. Blackwood's desire to impress influential guests made him predictable, his confidence in his own superiority made him careless, and his assumptions about his workers' capabilities created blind spots that could be exploited by those with superior knowledge of local conditions. Samuel's plan required perfect timing coordinated with environmental factors beyond human control. Weather patterns, seasonal animal migrations, and the natural cycles that governed water availability all had to align with human schedules in ways that created optimal conditions for decisive action. The approaching winter provided deadline pressure that would force rapid decisions without time for careful consideration of alternatives. Joshua's responsibility involved mapping escape routes and supply caches that would support extended operations in territory where conventional survival techniques might prove inadequate. His photographic memory allowed him to recall precise details about terrain features, seasonal weather patterns, and resource availability that would be crucial for long-term success. Every trail, every water source, every sheltered alcove had been cataloged and evaluated for strategic value. The brothers had spent months accumulating supplies through careful salvage and strategic acquisition. Items discarded or overlooked by the ranch workforce were collected and evaluated for potential utility. Broken tools were repaired, worn equipment was refurbished, and materials that seemed worthless to others were transformed into resources that could support independent operations. Food preservation presented particular challenges in desert conditions where traditional techniques often failed. The brothers had experimented with methods adapted from tribal practices, learning to prepare concentrated provisions that would remain edible for extended periods without refrigeration. Their hidden caches contained carefully rationed supplies positioned at strategic locations throughout the canyon system. Weapons acquisition required exceptional care given the serious consequences of discovery. Rather than attempting to steal firearms, which would be quickly missed, the brothers focused on tools that could serve defensive purposes while maintaining legitimate utility for assigned tasks. Knives, axes, and other implements were sharpened and modified to enhance their effectiveness without creating obvious evidence of hostile preparation. Intelligence gathering formed the crucial foundation for all other preparations. Samuel's literacy allowed him to read correspondence and documents that revealed details about Blackwood's business operations, political connections, and future plans. This information provided insight into timing, resource allocation, and the various factors that influenced decision-making by both family members and hired workforce. Joshua's tracking skills proved invaluable for monitoring the movement and behavior patterns of potential adversaries. He could determine which routes were used regularly, which individuals traveled alone or in groups, and how daily routines changed in response to weather or other external factors. This knowledge allowed the brothers to predict and prepare for various contingencies. The psychological dimension required the most careful management, as both brothers understood that their survival depended on maintaining the appearance of compliance while preparing for actions that would permanently alter their relationship with the Blackwood family. Years of enforced submission had taught them to conceal their thoughts and intentions behind masks of seeming cooperation. But the approaching expedition created pressure that made continued deception increasingly difficult. Blackwood's plans would take the hunting party deep into territory where the Freeman brothers possessed significant advantages over their captors, creating opportunities that might not present themselves again for years. The convergence of seasonal factors, environmental conditions, and human schedules had created circumstances that demanded action regardless of personal preferences. Both sides understood that the coming expedition would test everything they had learned about survival, strategy, and the exercise of power in frontier conditions. The difference lay in their assumptions about who possessed the knowledge and capabilities necessary for success in the unforgiving landscape of Devil's Canyon. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees below zero on the morning of October 12, 1852, creating conditions that would challenge the survival skills of even the most experienced frontiersmen. Ice crystals formed intricate patterns on the bunkhouse windows, and the breath of livestock created white clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. More significantly, the unusual cold had frozen several water sources that the hunting expedition planned to use during their 3-week journey into the canyon country. Jeremiah Blackwood discovered Samuel's carefully hidden preparations while conducting a final inspection of equipment and supplies. A loose board in the storage shed had revealed a cache of preserved food, modified tools, and most damning detailed maps showing water sources, escape routes, and strategic positions throughout Devil's Canyon. The evidence lay spread across Blackwood's desk like accusations written in careful handwriting that demonstrated both intelligence and premeditation. The maps revealed knowledge that went far beyond what enslaved workers should possess. Every spring, seasonal stream, and hidden alcove had been marked with notations indicating capacity, reliability, and defensive value. Escape routes were marked with calculations showing travel times, supply requirements, and alternative paths that could be used if primary routes became blocked. Most troubling, several locations were marked with symbols that suggested preparation for extended resistance rather than simple flight. 4 years of planning, Blackwood muttered, studying the detailed drawings with growing fury. The carpenter has been mapping every inch of this territory while pretending to follow orders. His wife Catherine examined the preserved food supplies, noting the sophisticated preparation techniques that indicated expertise far exceeding basic survival knowledge. "This isn't desperation," she observed. "This is strategic preparation by someone who understands long-term planning and resource management. Samuel has been preparing for war, not escape." The implications were clear to both family members. Their most trusted worker, the man they relied upon for navigation and camp management during hunting expeditions, had been systematically preparing to transform from guide into adversary. David, the eldest son, examined the tool modifications with the analytical eye of someone who understood both craftsmanship and violence. Knives had been resharpened and balanced for throwing as well as cutting. Axes showed careful attention to edge maintenance and handle wrapping that improved grip under adverse conditions. Even mundane items like rope and canvas had been treated to enhance durability and functionality. The family conference that followed revealed the depth of Blackwood's miscalculation regarding his workers, capabilities, and intentions. Catherine's business correspondence contained references to inquiries about slave prices in California, suggesting that economic pressures were forcing consideration of selling some workers to raise capital for territorial investments. The Freeman brothers, through Samuel's literacy, had likely discovered these plans and understood that their time at the ranch was ending regardless of their preferences. "We should have sold them months ago," William suggested, his 14-year-old voice carrying conviction beyond his years. "Keeping skilled workers creates problems that simple laborers never cause. Intelligence combined with desperation is dangerous." James, the youngest, offered his own observation with the unsettling perception that made adults uncomfortable. "Samuel has been watching us the same way we watch him," he said, "learning our routines, our weaknesses, our assumptions. He knows things about our operations that we've forgotten we revealed." The realization that their property had been studying them as carefully as they managed it created psychological discomfort that went beyond simple security concerns. Jeremiah's decision reflected both practical necessity and personal pride. The hunting expedition represented significant investment in reputation and political connections that could not be abandoned without substantial financial and social costs. Cancellation would raise questions about his competence and reliability that could damage future business prospects. More importantly, retreat would acknowledge that enslaved workers possessed the power to disrupt their master's plans through superior knowledge and preparation. "We proceed as scheduled," he announced, "but with modifications that will prevent any possibility of successful resistance." The family's countermeasures reflected their own strategic thinking and understanding of power dynamics in wilderness conditions. Additional hired men would be recruited from Fort Bridger, expanding the expedition's numbers and ensuring that any potential uprising would face overwhelming opposition. Security procedures would be enhanced throughout the journey. Weapons would be distributed only to family members and trusted employees, with ammunition controlled centrally to prevent unauthorized access. The Freeman brothers would be separated during the expedition, with Joshua assigned to advance scouting while Samuel remained with the main party where he could be monitored continuously. Most significantly, Blackwood planned to use the expedition as an opportunity to eliminate the problem permanently. Wilderness conditions created opportunities for accidents that would arouse no suspicion from territorial authorities. The Freeman brothers' superior knowledge of local conditions would be used against them, as they would be assigned to dangerous tasks where environmental hazards could provide plausible explanations for fatal mishaps. But Samuel had been monitoring the family's discussions through techniques developed over 4 years of careful observation. The ranch building's construction created acoustic properties that carried conversations between rooms, and his assigned duties often required him to work in locations where private discussions could be overheard without obvious eavesdropping. The Freeman brothers understood that discovery of their preparations had transformed their situation from planned escape to immediate survival necessity. Blackwood's decision to proceed with the expedition while implementing enhanced security measures indicated that he intended to eliminate them during the journey. The wilderness that they had hoped to use for concealment would become the site of their final confrontation with the family that had held them in bondage. Joshua's reaction demonstrated the cold calculation that years of oppression had developed in both brothers. "They're planning to kill us during the expedition," he said simply. "The question is whether we let them choose the time and place, or whether we seize the initiative." Samuel's response revealed the depth of preparation that had preceded discovery of their plans. "We've spent 4 years learning that canyon system," he replied. "They've spent 4 years assuming their authority would always be respected. Tomorrow we discover which kind of knowledge matters more in conditions where survival depends on competence rather than legal status." The brothers spent their final night in the bunkhouse refining plans that would need to adapt to circumstances they could not fully predict. The expedition would enter Devil's Canyon under conditions that favored their extensive knowledge of the terrain, but with security measures that limited their freedom of action, until opportunities could be created through careful manipulation of environmental factors and human psychology. Both sides understood that the coming weeks would test everything they had learned about power, survival, and the price of underestimating desperate men with superior knowledge of the battlefield where their final confrontation would be decided. The hunting party departed the ranch at dawn on October 15, 1852, 15 men riding into Devil's Canyon under conditions that would challenge even experienced frontiersmen. The temperature remained 20 degrees below normal, and ice formed on water containers within hours of departure. More significantly, the unusual weather had altered wildlife patterns throughout the canyon system, creating conditions that would test every assumption about territorial knowledge and survival capabilities. Jeremiah Blackwood rode at the head of the column, his imported rifle gleaming in the pale morning light as he led his guests toward what he believed would be his greatest triumph. Behind him rode territorial legislators Thomas Hartwell and Benjamin Crane, both men whose political influence could determine the success of future business ventures. Federal Marshal William Torres represented law enforcement authority that Blackwood needed for protection of his expanding operations. California merchant Alexander Hayes brought investment capital that could fund territorial development projects requiring substantial initial resources. The remaining men consisted of hired hands recruited from Fort Bridger specifically for their frontier experience and weapon skills. These were not casual laborers but professional scouts, former soldiers and trappers who understood wilderness conditions and possessed the practical competence necessary for extended operations in dangerous territory. Their presence was intended to ensure that no potential uprising by enslaved workers could threaten the expedition's success or the safety of influential guests. Samuel Freeman rode near the middle of the column, his position carefully chosen to allow maximum observation while maintaining the appearance of compliance with security arrangements. His assigned role as guide and camp manager provided legitimate reasons for studying terrain features, water sources, and the countless environmental factors that would influence their route through the canyon system. But his true purpose involved implementing plans that had been refined through months of preparation and years of accumulated knowledge. Joshua Freeman had departed 2 hours earlier as an advance scout, officially tasked with identifying optimal camping locations and assessing trail conditions ahead of the main party. His real mission involved activating supply caches, preparing strategic positions, and creating the infrastructure necessary for operations that would transform 15 well-armed men from hunters into prey. His photographic memory allowed him to recall precise details about terrain features, water sources, and seasonal patterns that would prove crucial for successful implementation of their carefully developed strategy. The first day's travel proceeded according to Blackwood's planned itinerary, following established trails through relatively open country that allowed the column to maintain good formation while making steady progress toward their first planned camping site. The guests expressed appropriate appreciation for the spectacular scenery, their enthusiasm encouraged by Blackwood's detailed commentary about geological formations, historical events, and the various natural phenomena that made the region unique among American territories. But Samuel noticed subtle signs that indicated the expedition was already deviating from optimal routes without Blackwood's awareness. The unusual weather had altered water flow patterns, making some previously reliable sources unavailable while creating temporary springs in locations that would not appear on existing maps. Game trails showed evidence of seasonal migrations occurring earlier than normal, suggesting that hunting opportunities would be found in different locations than previous expeditions had established. These environmental changes created opportunities for strategic misdirection that could prove valuable as the expedition moved deeper into territory where the Freeman brothers possessed decisive advantages. Samuel began implementing subtle course corrections, ostensibly to avoid difficult terrain or locate better camping sites, but actually to guide the party toward positions that would favor defensive operations over conventional hunting activities. The first night's camp was established in a natural amphitheater surrounded by sandstone walls that created excellent acoustics and limited approach routes. Blackwood praised the location's scenic beauty and strategic positioning, unaware that these same features would prove disadvantageous for conventional military tactics, while providing significant benefits for defenders familiar with the terrain's specific characteristics. Samuel managed camp setup with the efficiency that had made him valuable to previous expeditions, coordinating activities that provided comfort for the guests while ensuring proper maintenance of equipment and supplies. But his real attention focused on details that would prove crucial for later operations. He noted which men carried keys to supply containers, observed weapon storage procedures, and identified the various routine patterns that would create opportunities for strategic action when circumstances permitted. Joshua returned from his scouting mission with reports that satisfied Blackwood's expectations while concealing information that would prove crucial for subsequent developments. The advance reconnaissance had indeed identified optimal camping sites and assessed trail conditions, but it had also activated supply caches and prepared strategic positions that would support extended operations by forces familiar with local conditions and environmental factors. The second day's travel took the expedition deeper into the canyon system, where towering sandstone walls created narrow passages that limited visibility and compressed the column into vulnerable formations. The spectacular scenery continued to impress Blackwood's guests, but the terrain also began revealing the challenges that would test conventional assumptions about authority and competence in wilderness conditions. Water sources became increasingly important as the party moved away from reliable streams toward seasonal springs that required careful navigation to locate and access. Samuel's knowledge of these hidden sources allowed him to maintain the expedition's water supply, while guiding them toward positions that would prove strategically valuable for purposes the guests could not anticipate. The wildlife encountered during the second day demonstrated the environmental changes that were affecting normal patterns throughout the region. Deer and elk appeared in locations where previous expeditions had not found them, while traditional hunting grounds showed evidence of abandonment by species that had utilized them for decades. These shifts created confusion among the hired hands, whose territorial knowledge was based on previous years' experiences rather than current conditions. Samuel used this confusion to establish his expertise as the expedition's most reliable guide, offering explanations for environmental changes that demonstrated superior understanding of seasonal patterns and animal behavior. His growing influence with both guests and hired hands created opportunities for leadership that would prove valuable when circumstances required rapid decision-making under adverse conditions. By the third day, the expedition had penetrated deep enough into Devil's Canyon that retreat would require several days, travel under increasingly challenging conditions. The unusual weather continued, with temperatures remaining well below normal and ice forming on water sources that typically remained liquid throughout October. More importantly, the canyon's configuration began limiting their options for alternative routes, creating situations where forward progress became the only practical choice. Joshua's scouting reports consistently identified optimal routes that seemed to serve Blackwood's objectives while actually guiding the expedition toward positions that favored defensive operations over conventional hunting activities. His ability to navigate by landmarks that others missed or ignored made him indispensable for continued progress through increasingly complex terrain. The psychological dynamics within the expedition began shifting as environmental challenges tested the competence of different group members. Blackwood's hired hands possessed general frontier experience, But the specific conditions encountered in Devil's Canyon required expertise that only the Freeman brothers had developed through years of intensive study and practical application. Samuel's value as guide and camp manager became increasingly apparent as conventional navigation techniques proved inadequate for the terrain they were encountering. His ability to locate water sources, identify safe camping positions, and predict weather patterns made him essential for the expedition's continued success, creating influence that extended beyond his officially assigned role. The guests began directing questions to Samuel rather than their official host, when practical concerns about route selection and campsite preparation required immediate answers. This shift in attention created opportunities for Samuel to establish credibility while observing the various personality traits and decision-making patterns that would prove valuable for strategic planning. Marshal Torres proved particularly susceptible to demonstrations of competence and reliability, having spent enough time on the frontier to recognize genuine expertise when he encountered it. His growing confidence in Samuel's judgment created possibilities for influence that could prove decisive when circumstances required rapid action under adverse conditions. California merchant Hayes showed increasing concern about the expedition's duration and complexity, having expected a relatively straightforward hunting trip rather than an extended wilderness survival exercise. His anxiety about business commitments waiting in California made him receptive to suggestions that might accelerate their progress or simplify their operations. The territorial legislators demonstrated typical political instincts for avoiding personal risk while maintaining public confidence in their judgment. Their growing reliance on Samuel's expertise reflected recognition that their own survival might depend on following advice from someone who understood local conditions better than their official host. By the fourth day, the Freeman brothers had successfully positioned the expedition in terrain that favored their extensive knowledge of local conditions while limiting the conventional advantages possessed by well-armed opponents. The narrow canyon passages restricted movement options, seasonal weather patterns affected resource availability, and environmental challenges tested competence rather than equipment or numbers. Samuel's influence within the group had grown to the point where his recommendations carried weight equal to or greater than Blackwood's official authority. This psychological shift represented the foundation for more dramatic reversals that would follow as circumstances continued evolving in directions that favored superior knowledge over conventional power relationships. Joshua's advanced scouting had prepared strategic positions throughout the canyon system that could support extended operations by forces familiar with local terrain and environmental factors. Supply caches contained provisions that would sustain life under adverse conditions, while defensive positions offered advantages that could neutralize conventional military superiority through strategic use of geographical features. The hunting horns that Blackwood had brought to signal the expedition's locations and coordinate group activities would soon serve very different purposes, as the Freeman brothers implemented plans that transformed their role from guides into something that challenged every assumption about power, authority, and survival in the unforgiving landscape of Devil's Canyon. The evening of the fourth day marked the point where environmental factors, strategic positioning, and psychological dynamics converged to create conditions that would test everything both sides had learned about leadership, competence, and the price of underestimating desperate men with superior knowledge of the battlefield, where their ultimate confrontation would be decided. The blizzard struck Devil's Canyon at 2:47 in the morning on October 19, 1852, with a ferocity that transformed routine wilderness camping into a desperate struggle for survival. Temperatures plummeted to 38 degrees below zero, while winds exceeding 60 miles per hour created whiteout conditions that made navigation impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the canyon's unique acoustic and geographical properties. The storm arrived 6 weeks earlier than normal seasonal patterns, catching the hunting party in the most vulnerable position possible, deep within narrow canyon passages where conventional shelter techniques proved inadequate against the unprecedented weather conditions. Samuel Freeman had been anticipating these atmospheric changes for over a week, reading subtle environmental signs that escaped the notice of men who had never learned to interpret desert weather patterns with life-or-death precision. The unusual clarity of distant mountain peaks, the behavior of wildlife seeking unusual shelter locations, and the specific quality of wind currents through the canyon system had all indicated that exceptional weather was approaching with timing that would prove decisive for his carefully developed plans. While Jeremiah Blackwood's party huddled in inadequate tents that had been designed for conventional camping rather than survival in extreme conditions, Samuel moved through the storm with confidence born from years of studying the canyon's seasonal behavior patterns. His intimate knowledge of wind currents, sheltered alcoves, and the acoustic properties that allowed navigation even in complete darkness enabled him to function effectively under conditions that left his former captors helpless and dependent. The Freeman brothers had spent months preparing for exactly these circumstances, creating supply caches and shelter positions that could sustain life during extended periods of adverse weather. Their preparations went far beyond simple survival, encompassing strategic positioning that would allow them to monitor and influence the movements of opponents whose conventional advantages in numbers and equipment became meaningless when environmental factors eliminated visibility and limited mobility to areas where superior local knowledge provided decisive tactical advantages. Joshua had positioned himself at a natural observatory point that commanded views of all possible approach routes to the main party's camping area, despite the storm conditions that made conventional surveillance impossible. His ability to navigate by sound, wind direction, and the subtle geographical features that remained detectable even during blizzard conditions allowed him to maintain strategic awareness while remaining invisible to opponents whose survival depended entirely on maintaining inadequate shelter against the unprecedented weather. The psychological transformation that occurred during the first night of the storm revealed the true nature of power relationships when environmental factors stripped away the artificial advantages that legal status and conventional authority provided under normal circumstances. Men who had commanded absolute obedience from their workers discovered that survival depended on capabilities they had never bothered to develop, while those they had regarded as property possessed expertise that became literally invaluable when mistakes meant death within hours. Samuel's first decisive action involved rescuing Federal Marshal Torres from a tent collapse that would have resulted in fatal exposure within minutes. The marshal's survival depended entirely on Samuel's ability to locate him during whiteout conditions, provide emergency medical attention for hypothermia symptoms, and transport him to sheltered positions that offered protection against wind velocities that made conventional camping equipment useless. The rescue established Samuel's credibility as the expedition's most competent survival expert, while creating a debt of gratitude that fundamentally altered the psychological dynamics between former slave and federal law enforcement officer. Torres understood with crystalline clarity that his life had been preserved by someone who possessed no legal obligation to provide assistance, creating moral complications that challenged his assumptions about authority, competence, and the nature of human relationships under extreme circumstances. California merchant Alexander Hayes required similar intervention when his inadequate cold weather preparations resulted in frostbite symptoms that threatened permanent disability or death without immediate treatment. Samuel's knowledge of traditional remedies and emergency medical techniques proved superior to conventional approaches, providing effective treatment that preserved Hayes's mobility while demonstrating competence that commanded respect regardless of legal or social status. The territorial legislators Thomas Hartwell and Benjamin Crane discovered that their political authority meant nothing when environmental factors required practical skills they had never acquired. Their survival depended entirely on following instructions from someone who understood cold weather survival techniques, shelter construction methods, and the various specialized knowledge necessary for maintaining life under conditions where conventional resources proved inadequate. Jeremiah Blackwood's reaction to his complete dependence on Samuel's expertise revealed the psychological stress that occurred when deeply held assumptions about power and competence collided with environmental realities that made conventional authority structures irrelevant. His fury at being reduced to following orders from his former property was tempered by recognition that his family's survival depended on cooperating with someone who possessed capabilities that exceeded his own under current circumstances. Catherine Blackwood adapted to the reversed power dynamics with pragmatic intelligence that revealed character traits her privileged background had never required her to develop. She understood that survival took precedence over social conventions, accepting Samuel's authority over practical decisions while maintaining her role as coordinator for activities that required her organizational and social skills but not wilderness expertise. The Blackwood sons responded to the crisis according to their individual personalities and capabilities. David, the eldest, recognized Samuel's superior competence and adapted his behavior accordingly, understanding that resistance would serve no practical purpose under circumstances where cooperation was essential for survival. William focused on learning survival techniques that might prove useful for future situations, while James retreated into psychological detachment that protected him from acknowledging the fundamental reversal of family power relationships. The hired hands from Fort Bridger possessed frontier experience that made them more adaptable to the changed circumstances than the family members who had never questioned their assumptions about authority and competence. These men understood that wilderness survival required following whoever demonstrated the most reliable knowledge, regardless of conventional social hierarchies or legal relationships. Samuel's management of the crisis demonstrated strategic thinking that went far beyond simple survival necessity. His actions established patterns of leadership and decision-making authority that would persist after immediate weather emergencies passed, creating new power relationships based on demonstrated competence rather than inherited status or legal documentation. The supply distribution system that Samuel implemented during the storm revealed the extent of his advanced preparation and strategic planning. Hidden caches contained not just survival provisions but luxury items that had been systematically accumulated through months of careful salvage and strategic acquisition. Coffee, sugar, preserved meat, and other supplies that exceeded anything available to the official expedition created comfort levels that reinforced Samuel's authority while demonstrating the inadequacy of Blackwood's preparations. Joshua's role during the crisis involved eliminating specific threats to the brothers' long-term objectives while maintaining the appearance of providing general assistance to the expedition members. His knowledge of canyon topography allowed him to guide certain individuals into positions where environmental hazards could provide solutions to problems that direct confrontation might not resolve as effectively. The process began with the hired hands who had been specifically recruited for their weapons skills and potential resistance to any uprising by enslaved workers. These men possessed frontier competence that made them dangerous opponents under normal circumstances. But their unfamiliarity with Devil's Canyon-specific hazards created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with superior local knowledge and advanced preparation. Thomas McKinnon, a former cavalry sergeant hired specifically for his military experience and leadership capabilities, disappeared during the second day of the storm, while attempting to retrieve supplies from a cache that Joshua had reported discovering near the expedition's original camping site. The canyon's complex acoustic properties made it impossible to determine his exact location when calls for assistance went unanswered, and the extreme weather conditions prevented effective search operations until environmental factors had eliminated any possibility of successful rescue. James Patterson and Robert Stone, both experienced trackers whose skills might have proved dangerous during extended wilderness operations, encountered similar difficulties while following Joshua's directions to alternate shelter sites that promised better protection against the continuing storm conditions. Their disappearance occurred under circumstances that appeared entirely consistent with the environmental hazards that challenged even experienced frontiersmen during unprecedented weather conditions. The psychological impact of these disappearances created fear and uncertainty among the remaining expedition members, while establishing Samuel's indispensability as the only reliable guide for navigation through terrain where environmental factors made conventional survival techniques inadequate. His ability to maintain group cohesion and provide effective leadership under adverse conditions transformed him from reluctant participant into acknowledged expedition commander. By the third day of the storm, the power relationships within the remaining group had been completely transformed through a combination of demonstrated competence, strategic preparation, and environmental factors that eliminated conventional advantages possessed by those who had previously held authority through legal status, rather than practical capability. Samuel's decisions were followed without question because survival depended on recognizing expertise regardless of its source. The weather cleared on October 22nd, revealing a landscape that had been transformed by the unprecedented storm into terrain that challenged even Samuel's extensive knowledge of the canyon system. Snow depths exceeded 6 feet in areas that had never experienced significant accumulation, while ice formations created barriers that blocked previously reliable routes and forced the adoption of alternative paths that only the Freeman brothers knew how to navigate safely. The surviving expedition members emerged from their shelters to discover that their situation had been fundamentally altered by more than just environmental factors. The disappearance of the hired hands eliminated the primary source of potential armed resistance to any changes in group leadership, while the demonstrated incompetence of official authority figures created power vacuums that Samuel filled through practical necessity rather than political maneuvering. Joshua's systematic approach to route planning guided the reduced party along paths that served multiple strategic purposes while maintaining the appearance of simple navigation through difficult terrain. The routes he selected led toward prepared positions that offered both immediate shelter and long-term defensive advantages. while avoiding areas where surviving expedition members might discover evidence of his advanced preparations or strategic positioning. The hunting horns that Blackwood had brought to coordinate group activities began serving different purposes as Samuel established communication protocols that reflected his assumption of practical leadership responsibilities. The traditional signals were replaced by patterns that served tactical coordination needs, while maintaining contact between separated group members during navigation through terrain where visual contact remained impossible. Samuel's establishment of camp routines, food distribution systems, and security procedures reflected his understanding that temporary emergency leadership would need to evolve into permanent authority structures if the group was to survive the remaining weeks of their planned expedition. His decisions consistently reinforced patterns that acknowledged his expertise while creating psychological acceptance of his leadership role among people who had never questioned their assumptions about social hierarchy. The transformation was made complete when Jeremiah Blackwood formally requested Samuel's guidance for all major decisions affecting the expedition's continued operations. This acknowledgement of reversed authority relationships occurred without dramatic confrontation or explicit discussion of changing power dynamics, but simply through recognition that survival required following whoever possessed the most reliable knowledge under current circumstances. Federal Marshal Torres's acceptance of Samuel's leadership carried particular significance because his law enforcement authority represented federal recognition of conventional power relationships that had previously defined territorial social structure. His willingness to follow directions from someone who possessed no legal standing created precedents that challenged fundamental assumptions about authority, competence, and the nature of legitimate leadership under frontier conditions. The remaining members of Blackwood's hunting party had become participants in an experiment that tested whether power relationships based on legal status and inherited privilege could survive environmental challenges that required practical competence rather than social credentials. The answer was being written in the snow-covered depths of Devil's Canyon, where the hunting horns that still echoed through the silence carried messages that would reshape territorial understanding of leadership, survival, and the price of underestimating desperate men with superior knowledge of the battlefield where their victory was now assured. The transformation of Devil's Canyon from hunting ground to something far more significant began during the final week of October 1852, when the surviving members of Jeremiah Blackwood's expedition emerged from the wilderness forever changed by their experience of reversed power relationships and environmental challenges that had stripped away conventional assumptions about authority, competence, and survival capability. What they had witnessed during those crucial weeks would influence territorial development for decades, while creating legends that challenged comfortable narratives about frontier life and the nature of human freedom. Samuel Freeman's establishment of permanent authority over the expedition's survivors represented more than temporary leadership during crisis conditions. His systematic approach to resource management, route planning, and group coordination had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything the territorial government had seen from conventional expedition leaders, creating recognition that spread far beyond the immediate participants when they eventually returned to Fort Bridger with stories that commanded attention throughout Utah Territory. The immediate practical consequence involved Samuel's assumption of legal control over Blackwood's extensive property holdings through a combination of territorial law, demonstrated competence, and the reluctant acknowledgement of surviving family members who understood that their economic survival depended on accepting changed circumstances they lacked the capability to reverse. The legal mechanisms that accomplished this transformation reflected the complex realities of frontier society, where practical competence often mattered more than inherited privilege when survival was at stake. Territorial records found in the Utah State Archives during a 1987 renovation project revealed the systematic process through which Samuel Freeman transitioned from enslaved worker to legitimate property owner through a series of legal documents that satisfied both federal requirements and local necessities. The paperwork filed between November 1852 and March 1853 showed careful attention to legal precedents while establishing new frameworks for property transfer under exceptional circumstances. Federal Marshal William Torres played a crucial role in legitimizing this transition, his official reports emphasizing Samuel's exceptional competence as expedition leader, while describing Jeremiah Blackwood's voluntary decision to transfer property ownership in recognition of his guide's superior capabilities. Torres's law enforcement authority provided federal validation for arrangements that might otherwise have faced legal challenges from territorial officials unfamiliar with the specific circumstances that had created these unprecedented power relationships. The Marshal's final report, dated November 30, 1852, contained language that would influence federal policy regarding frontier property rights for the next several decades. Competence demonstrated under extreme conditions provides more reliable foundation for property ownership than inherited status or conventional legal documentation, Torres wrote. Freeman's management of crisis conditions exceeded anything achieved by previous territorial expeditions, establishing practical authority that serves federal interests better than maintaining artificial legal relationships that environmental factors had already rendered meaningless. California merchant Alexander Hayes returned to his business operations with investment capital redirected toward partnerships with Samuel Freeman, rather than the Blackwood family enterprises that had originally attracted his attention. His correspondence with business associates in San Francisco, preserved in the California Historical Society archives, described Freeman as the most capable expedition leader and resource manager encountered during extensive frontier travel, possessing practical knowledge that exceeds theoretical education by considerable margins. Hayes's testimonial carried significant weight among California business circles, where practical competence commanded respect regardless of social background or conventional credentials. His endorsement created investment opportunities that provided Samuel with capital necessary for expanding operations beyond simple ranch management toward territorial business ventures that would influence Utah's economic development for decades. The territorial legislators Thomas Hartwell and Benjamin Crane faced complex political challenges when they returned to Salt Lake City, with accounts of events that challenged conventional assumptions about social hierarchies, legal relationships, and the nature of legitimate authority under frontier conditions. Their political survival required presenting the expedition's outcome in terms that satisfied constituent expectations while acknowledging realities they had personally experienced. Hartwell's legislative proposal, introduced during the 1853 territorial session, established new legal frameworks for property transfer based on demonstrated competence rather than inherited status. The legislation created precedents that would influence territorial law for the remainder of the 19th century, establishing practical capability as legitimate foundation for property ownership when environmental factors eliminated conventional social structures. Crane's committee hearings on frontier survival and territorial development featured Samuel Freeman as expert witness, whose testimony influenced federal policy regarding territorial administration, property rights, and the complex legal relationships that govern frontier society. His recommendations shaped territorial law in ways that provided greater recognition for practical competence while reducing dependence on inherited privilege or conventional social credentials. The Blackwood family's adaptation to their changed circumstances revealed different responses to reversed power relationships and economic dependence on someone who had previously been their property. Catherine Blackwood demonstrated pragmatic intelligence by accepting her reduced status while contributing organizational skills that remained valuable for managing complex business operations, creating working relationships that served mutual interests despite dramatically altered power dynamics. David Blackwood, the eldest son, eventually established himself as Samuel's business partner rather than inherited successor to family enterprises, his adaptation to changed circumstances reflecting recognition that survival required accepting new realities regardless of personal preferences or previous expectations. His partnership agreement, recorded in territorial land office records, provided him with management responsibilities that utilized his education and social connections, while acknowledging Samuel's ultimate authority over major business decisions. William and James Blackwood responded to their family's transformation according to their individual personalities and capabilities, with William focusing on learning practical skills that would make him valuable under changed circumstances, while James struggled with psychological adjustments that required years to resolve completely. Their different adaptation strategies illustrated the various ways individuals responded to fundamental alterations in power relationships and social expectations. Joshua Freeman's role in the post-expedition period involved expanding their territorial influence through systematic exploration and mapping of canyon country that established the brothers as the territory's premier guides for government surveys, mining expeditions, and other business ventures requiring intimate knowledge of difficult terrain and environmental conditions. His photographic memory and navigation skills proved invaluable for territorial development projects that required accurate mapping of previously unexplored regions. The supply caches and strategic positions that Joshua had prepared throughout Devil's Canyon became the foundation for a communication and transportation network that served territorial development while providing the brothers with strategic advantages that ensured their continued influence over regional business activities. This infrastructure created economic opportunities that extended far beyond simple ranch management toward territorial enterprises that would influence Utah's development for generations. Archaeological investigations conducted by the University of Utah during the 1990s uncovered evidence that supported many aspects of the Freeman brothers' story while revealing additional details about their territorial influence that had not appeared in official records. Excavations at former Blackwood Ranch sites revealed sophisticated water management systems, defensive positions, and supply storage facilities that demonstrated engineering capabilities exceeding anything attributed to conventional territorial settlers. The most significant archaeological discovery involved a hidden chamber beneath the ranch's main building that contained personal effects from both the Blackwood family and the Freeman brothers, arranged in patterns that suggested commemoration rather than casual storage. Items included clothing, personal documents, tools, and weapons arranged with care that indicated deliberate preservation of materials representing the transformation that had occurred during October 1852. Modern forensic analysis of artifacts found at Devil's Canyon excavation sites confirmed details about the expedition that had been preserved in oral traditions but never documented in official records. Evidence of extended winter occupation, sophisticated shelter construction, and resource management techniques that exceeded conventional survival methods supported accounts of the Freeman brothers' exceptional capabilities while raising questions about other aspects of their territorial influence. The hunting horns that had given the story its supernatural dimension were discovered during a 2003 archaeological survey, buried in locations throughout the canyon system that suggested systematic placement for strategic communication purposes rather than casual abandonment. Acoustic analysis revealed that these instruments had been modified to produce sound patterns that carried across canyon distances with clarity that exceeded conventional hunting horn capabilities. Local Ute tribal historians interviewed during the 1960s as part of federal oral history preservation projects provided perspectives on the Freeman brothers that revealed their integration into indigenous social networks and their adoption of traditional survival techniques that supplemented their own considerable knowledge of canyon country. These accounts describe Samuel and Joshua as bridge people, who understood both white and native approaches to territorial survival while developing innovations that exceeded either tradition individually. The tribal accounts also explained the acoustic phenomena that had puzzled territorial authorities for decades after the expedition's conclusion. The hunting horns continued sounding throughout Devil's Canyon during winter storms because the Freeman brothers had established a communication system that served coordination needs for their expanding territorial operations, using modified instruments and strategic positioning that created sound patterns carrying across vast distances, even during adverse weather conditions. Modern visitors to Devil's Canyon continue reporting experiences that suggest the Freeman brothers' influence persists in ways that challenge conventional understanding of historical events and their long-term consequences. Hikers describe hearing hunting horn calls during winter conditions when no other persons are present in the canyon system, while archaeological teams report discovering supply caches and shelter facilities that show evidence of recent maintenance despite their apparent abandonment over a century ago. The National Park Service, which assumed management of Devil's Canyon during the 1970s, maintains official files documenting these reports, while acknowledging that conventional explanations fail to account for all observed phenomena. Park rangers familiar with the territory confirm that acoustic properties of the canyon system create unusual sound transmission effects, but the consistency and timing of hunting horn reports suggest influences beyond simple environmental factors. Regional folklore that developed around the Freeman brothers' story reflects complex attitudes toward themes of justice, competence, and the transformation of power relationships under extreme circumstances. Different communities interpret the same events according to their own social perspectives and historical experiences, creating multiple narratives that serve various cultural functions while preserving core elements of the original story. Some traditions emphasize the brothers' exceptional survival skills and territorial knowledge as examples of human potential that transcends artificial social limitations imposed by legal systems or conventional authority structures. Other accounts focus on the transformation of power relationships through demonstrated competence rather than inherited privilege, creating moral lessons about the importance of practical capability over social credentials. The most persistent folklore elements involve the ongoing presence that many people sense when traveling through Devil's Canyon, describing experiences of guidance, protection, or warning that suggest the Freeman brothers' territorial influence continues operating according to principles they established during their transformation from enslaved workers to acknowledged leaders of one of Utah Territory's most significant wilderness regions. Academic historians studying the Freeman brothers' territorial influence have identified their story as a crucial example of how environmental factors, practical competence, and individual determination could overcome legal restrictions and social limitations that seemed absolute under normal circumstances. Their success established precedents that influenced territorial law, while creating models for frontier leadership that challenged conventional assumptions about authority and social hierarchy. The hunting horns that still echo through Devil's Canyon during winter storms serve as reminders that some transformations create permanent changes in the relationships between people, places, and power structures that govern society. The Freeman brothers' story continues resonating because it demonstrates how knowledge, determination, and strategic thinking can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles while establishing new forms of authority based on competence rather than inherited privilege. Whether the acoustic phenomena reported by modern visitors represent supernatural persistence of the Freeman brothers' influence or natural environmental factors that create unusual sound transmission effects, the continuing mystery ensures that their story remains relevant for each generation that encounters Devil's Canyon and wonders about the price of freedom and the nature of legitimate authority in places where survival depends on capabilities rather than credentials. The legacy of Samuel and Joshua Freeman extends far beyond their personal transformation from enslaved workers to territorial leaders, encompassing broader questions about justice, competence, and the possibility of fundamental change in power relationships when environmental factors eliminate artificial advantages and force recognition of practical capability over conventional social status. Their story continues challenging comfortable assumptions about authority while demonstrating that some victories echo across generations in ways that reshape understanding of human potential and the price of underestimating desperate people with superior knowledge of the territories where ultimate battles for freedom are fought and won. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.